Okay, so hopefully this now is visible for everybody, and you can all see this. So the title of the talk is The Landscape Legacies of the Ordnance Survey, and it's a talk that really, for me, is a kind of starting point for a journey, which I hope will be an interesting and fruitful one through the Landscape Partnership Scheme, with volunteers and also with those involved directly with the Landscape Partnership Scheme at Binevenagh. So as Grace was saying, it's actually a place where a few years ago, actually, we had the opportunity to visit with some people from the local community, and that was great fun, actually. And one of the things that was undertaken at that time, if I just get my thing to work here properly, one of the things that was undertaken at that time, those of you who were there might remember being recorded actually for Your Place and Mine, and Helen Mark, who was the person out with us interviewing not just me but a whole group of us actually, and we had really great time. There was, I think we were there out in March 2 years ago. So if apparently though, if you want to check this out, the interview is still there for us. You can listen on Your Place and Mine on BBC Radio Ulster, I think it is. So what I'm doing this evening really, although it's kind of looking forward in some ways to this project called Mapping Monuments, which is fantastic, funded by Heritage Fund, National Lottery Heritage Fund, thank you for that. It's also building on something which we've been developing, I suppose, for a little while now, me and colleagues at Queen's in geography and archaeology, and also people in the local community, and especially, of course, Grace and Andrew as well. So we're kind of hopefully building up some momentum on this. And my talk this evening, I hope I won't put you off. I hope it might kind of spark an interest. You clearly already have an interest, those of you who've tuned into this, and which is really very much appreciated, as I say. So what are we going to be doing this evening? Well, I thought it would be worthwhile at least to start off with something about the project itself, the Mapping Monuments project. And this is some information which was in our bid, which we put forward, or which Andrew put forward really, to the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I thought it would be quite useful just to flag up what do we want to deliver, you know, in the next 2 years through this project. And the timing is really critical. And I think Grace has already mentioned the Bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. 2024 is the year to watch out for. So we're in good time. Okay, so it's 2021. We may be a little bit delayed because of the you know why. And I still think, though, there's lots of really exciting things we can do. We've got the digital web resource to build. We've got the exhibition to think about. Building the exhibition itself will reflect the community project, the community heritage project, looking at the heritage of the Ordnance Survey, which you'll hear a little bit about this evening. A conference where we hope to bring people together from different parts of the world, all being well by then, of course, and some marketing, publicity, outreach to increase awareness of the importance of the heritage of the Ordnance Survey within the Binevenagh area. That's something which I really want to see actually happen, because it is of global importance. I mean, I know we really appreciate this heritage from our perspective here on the island and in Northern Ireland and around Binevenagh and so on. But what we're looking at here is of global importance, and it's something I'm going to return to towards the end of my talk. So as well as visiting the Giant's Causeway, wouldn't it be great if people came to Ballykelly and actually saw some of these features in the landscape and had some interpretation? And also digital management, heritage management, using digital methods of recording the heritage and actually embedding that into processes of heritage management. So these are kinds of things that I think we ought to be able to achieve through this project, thanks to the funding. And the picture there, those of you who were with us back 2 years ago might remember us visiting the various sites and walking across the fields with permission. So this is North Base Tower. Those of you not familiar with this part of Ireland and Northern Ireland, then you'll see some images to maybe help orientate you In fact, the whole talk is well illustrated. So sit back, folks, get yourself a nice cup of tea, cup of coffee, or whatever you fancy, and hopefully you'll enjoy some nice images here and a few stories about the Ordnance Survey in and around Binevenagh. So I'm starting off then with a quotation here, and I mentioned already the Bicentenary and the importance of 2024, and this little quotation here comes from a memoir written about Thomas Colby, who is the chap up there in the right hand part of the image here. And Portlock wrote a memoir about Colby's activities as a surveyor, working for the Ordnance Survey across these islands, not just in Ireland, but also in Great Britain as well. And this little quotation here refers to Colby traversing Ireland from north to south in 1824, selecting suitable mountains for principal stations. This is all part of the survey work that was being undertaken 200 years ago, and collecting information for determining altitude to be represented in the map. So what we're looking at here then is a process which was really important at the time, actually. So it's really important to emphasize that. This was groundbreaking stuff, and this is why the Ordnance Survey's operations around Binevenagh actually are of global importance, because really what Colby and his men were doing was something quite remarkable, as I hope to be able to reveal to you in the next few minutes. So there's a picture of Portlock, who we have to thank for the memoir of Colby. It's quite a fawning sort of memoir, really. So if you read it, it is available online. But it's actually quite rich, and I'm going to give you some quotations from this as we go through. Because Portlock was working with Colby in the field, and it's the field really, literally in this case you can see in the image, it's the field that attracts me. It's the field which really draws me in to the legacies of the Ordnance Survey, and that's something which I think has been rather neglected in studies of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. Over the years, it's been fairly well studied. So it's going back into the landscape, which is represented by the 6-inch Ordnance Survey maps, which thankfully now we are able to access so much more easily through the Prony Historical Map Viewer. It'd be great if those of you who haven't seen this yet, just to check this out, because it is an amazing resource, and it has historic Ordnance Survey maps for Northern Ireland. And look, just getting a little extract here with Binevenagh from the first edition Ordnance Survey 6-inch series of maps for the island of Ireland, which at that time was a groundbreaking piece of survey work and a groundbreaking piece of cartography. It was the first entire country to be mapped at this large scale in the world, you know, not just in Europe, but in the world. This is a major achievement, this kind of level of detailed mapping and survey work. And it's been kind of popularized, really. The activities of the Ordnance Survey here, I think, actually resonate quite strongly, popularized partly perhaps through, you know, plays like Brian Friel's translations, probably most famously, and the kind of ways in which this is popularized often perhaps maybe overemphasizes the role of the Ordnance Survey in perhaps renaming the landscape. And this is what Friel is interested in here, is the process of translating place names, which the Ordnance Survey were certainly very interested in place names and gathered place names. And as part of the map making process through field work. So they've got Friel as a little quotation there. The captain is the man, this is from the play, is the man who makes the map, and George's task is to see that the place names on the map are correct. So it kind of hints at this complexity of field work, and that's something else I'm really curious about, actually. It's been well researched from an archival point of view by John Andrews, I'm afraid no longer with us, but in this amazing book called A Paper Landscape, appropriately enough, because he was really interested in the maps themselves and the archives relating to the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, and revealing from those archives how the Ordnance Survey operated 200 years ago. And this sort of interest has been developed over the years. I mean, Andrew's book came out in 1976 originally, but since then there's been a whole series of of similar kinds of books, interested, again, mainly written from an archival, from a documentary historical perspective. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You know, I mean, it's great stuff. There's no doubt about it. I love reading it. But there's another side to the story which tends to be a little bit neglected. And it's that other side of the story that I'm interested in developing through mapping monuments. And it's the story from the field, from the landscape, an archaeological as opposed to perhaps an historical narrative about the Ordnance Survey's operations on the island of Ireland 200 years ago. I want to return to the field, to those locations, those localities where the Ordnance Survey were surveying the ground, surveying the landscape, these sites of survey, which are nicely illustrated, I think, in that more or less contemporary drawing in the bottom right-hand side there. These lavishly uniformed men, the sappers and miners, with their instruments, their theodolites, which you can see the two men there with the theodolites, looking across to a trigonometrical station, which is the sort of beacon type thing. And in the foreground or between them, you'll see as well a camp as well, you know. So this image, very evocative and probably slightly fanciful, but nevertheless is, I think, a really nice insight into those field operations, life in the field under the Ordnance Survey 200 years ago. And behind the map is the other thing I want to try and get us to think about here. We tend to perhaps, especially archaeologically and historically and geographically, maybe focus a lot on the map image. Understandably, the map image tells us a lot about the landscape. But I want to look behind the map to the landscape itself, to what was going on in the landscape and what the remains of the Ordnance Survey are in that landscape, because the Ordnance Survey did leave sites and monuments, landscape legacies, if you like, in the local landscape from their field operations. And the part of the survey work I'm going to focus on in this talk is that relating to the trigonometrical survey, as it's called, a little definition of what this is about: a survey of a portion of country by measuring a single base and connecting it with various points in the tract surveyed by a series of triangles. This is triangulation. It's trigonometrical survey. And the map on the left-hand side from the middle part of the 19th century gives an indication of this trigonometrical survey for Ireland. And you'll see those straight lines radiating out from single points on that map. And those single points are the fixed stations, the trigonometrical stations, stations like in that image there, fixed by a beacon. And what these men were doing is they were setting up their theodolites on each of these fixed points, usually mountains in the case of Ireland. And those are the points where the lines meet. They were fixing up their theodolites and making observations to record angles. And these angles are necessary for calculating by an indirect means distances. So instead of traipsing around the whole of Ireland by ground and running chains along the ground, which would be a traditional way of doing a survey, the theodolite is an indirect means of surveying and setting up your theodolite on these mountain tops. And as you can see from some of the distances there, undertaking observations for quite some considerable distances and recording those provides then what's called a control, a ground control network on which your map is based. So this trigonometrical network is like, in effect, the foundations to those Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps we were looking at a moment ago. And this is the thing that I think is of interest, because it takes us to the field. It takes us into the landscape to think about what lies behind the map and what legacies there are in the field today still from 200 years ago of these Ordnance Survey operations. So in relation to my talk then, some of you may recognize this particular view, I hope, looking northwards towards County Donegal and the Inishowen Peninsula across Lough Foyle and Binevenagh in the left-hand side there, McGilligan off towards the right, Derry in the distance. So what I'm going to be talking about is the different legacies that these field operations have left behind in the landscapes of Ireland. Now, I'm going to try and not just focus in on the locality itself, but contextualize it by making connections to other legacies of the Ordnance Survey in these islands. I've been working in Great Britain. I've been working with a group in Scotland, for example, on this. as well as here in Ireland in the north. So I want to try and contextualize the field operations and the landscape legacies of the Ordnance Survey. And I'm going to do that really by dividing these mapping monuments, as I call them, into three different types. The first to do with baselines, which relates particularly, of course, to the Lough Foyle baseline, which a number of us have visited a couple of years ago, and will, for many of you, be familiar from the place you live. Then I'm going to turn to look at the trigonometrical stations themselves and what was going on in those under the Ordnance Survey. So the kind of hilltop locations where the theodolite was set up and where the men camped. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk a little bit about another kind of operation to do with field survey, which is leveling, which is another really important part of the map making process of the Ordnance Survey in the 19th century. And then towards the end, by way of some sort of conclusion, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means from a heritage point of view, because it is very significant heritage and it demands, I think, our attention. So that's the order of service, if you like. So I'm going to start off, first of all, with saying a little bit about these baselines and burials. So this is a close-up image of that map I showed you a moment ago, and I put it up here really to give you a little bit of detail about this Lough Foyle baseline. Those of you who are not familiar with this part of the world, let me locate it first of all. It's in the green box there, up on the north coast of Northern Ireland, so on the edge on the eastern side of Lough Foyle. And the Lough Foyle baseline was actually one part of a series of observations, of field observations undertaken by the Ordnance Survey, linked into these trigonometrical stations, these observation stations on mountain tops, and you'll see those listed there. So I want to take on a little journey around these different sites and say a little bit about the significance of these and how they fit together and what remains today in the landscape of these features, these mapping monuments. The Lough Foyle baseline itself came really at the end of the creation of those trigonometrical stations. So it was being measured very accurately under Thomas Colby between 1827 and 1828, as you can see there. And the whole idea of having a baseline is to provide the surveyors with a fixed linear measure that is a baseline on which all of the other trigonometrical calculations can be based. So the baseline and a very accurate ground measurement was an absolutely important and integral part of the trigonometrical survey of Ireland as a whole. It was this kind of thing that was being carried out in other places as well. It's not peculiar to the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, but what is peculiar and what was novel was the approach that Colby developed for the Lough Foyle baseline measurement. So in the image there, which comes from that more or less contemporary account by Captain Lowlands from 1847, an account of the measurement of the Lough Foyle base, you can see there various instruments scattered about, trestles, the tripods for measurement instruments like theodolites. You can see the men themselves seem to be working on what looks like a sort of long beam resting on these trestles. And it's that long beam, the so-called Colby's bars, which was the huge innovation, because these bars, unlike previous ways of measuring baselines, were much, much more accurate and much less inclined to distort the measurements themselves, as you'll see in a minute, with different means of measurement before Colby was working on the Lough Foyle baseline. But look for a moment at the paraphernalia associated with this. And I think we can be pretty sure that this is a fair representation of the process itself. So you see in the distance a tent, one of the men's tents, or the surveyor's tents, and underneath the tarpaulins there, those sort of triangular shaped tents, the sheets being drawn down, were these bars. And the reason the sheets were being drawn down or kept to protect the bars is because the bars themselves were made of metal, and the surveyors did not want them to be heating up or cooling down and changing, therefore, their length. So all of this was being undertaken. There's a little image on the bottom right-hand side there, again, from that book about the Lough Foyle baseline. All these measurements were being undertaken, 7.89 miles, along that very flat coastal piece of land between Ballykelly and McGillicuddy, which you can see in the little map there. And from that baseline, different readings were undertaken, not just along the baseline, but to other points around abouts, higher points. And that's that, on that basis that the trigonometrical observations could be calculated, and the distances, those indirect distances between stations, measured. Now, if you happen to be in Dublin, and let's hope we can soon visit Dublin and other places, then, and you were to visit Phoenix Park, which is the headquarters of the Ordnance Survey of Ireland in the south, then there's a little museum. And in this museum, we have here a photograph I took a few years ago, thanks to the guys there, a picture of the Colby's bars, which have survived for 200 years, which is amazing, isn't it, really? But not just that, Colby's bars were so important, such a massive scientific breakthrough at the time for what was called geodetics. Geodetics is the measurement of the Earth's size and shape. That these bars were actually transported all the way to India because George Everest, who you'll see a little bit later on, visited Colby to observe these operations around Lough Foyle base, and then decided that this was the way he should be working in India for the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, which is on a massive scale compared to the Survey of Ireland. So this is why the Ordnance Survey heritage in Ireland and Lough Foyle baseline and these places is of global and indeed international significance. This is why I think we need to pay more attention to it. So I mentioned a moment ago why Colby's bars were a kind of innovation, because if we went back before he was measuring Lough Foyle baseline, not that long actually, to the latter part of the 18th century, before Thomas Colby took over the directorship of the Ordnance Survey, it was being led by this chap, William Mudge, also a military man like Colby. But at this particular time, the base, this is Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, so in the south of England. You'll see on the map here from National Library of Scotland's web mapping platform, an early 1-inch Ordnance Survey map actually here. And you'll see on it, it says gun, end of base. What on earth does that mean? Well, what that map is telling us is that that point, the gun, was the end of a baseline created and measured, very similar to what Colby was doing, but earlier, but in this case for Salisbury Plain. But instead of Colby's bars, because he hadn't invented them there, at that point, for Mudge, he was using chains. And you can see that in the little picture there. And of course, the thing about chains is that they're not really very straight and they tend to bend and curve. And if you're trying to try and measure something really accurately, then chains can be slightly problematic. But this was the technology that was being used by Mudge. And the little picture there, there's a stone marking the end. This is kind of commemorated by that little stone there near Salisbury. But the kind of weird thing looks like a bit like a bird bath. Actually, is the gun. It's a cannon. This is what the Ordnance Survey did. From their military trained. Yeah. So this is their gun. This is the cannon which they upended vertically, dropped into the ground to mark the terminal point of this baseline on Salisbury Plain. Colby again took a slightly different approach to his baseline. When it came to marking the terminal points, the kinds of structures he used were not guns, which if you think about it, were probably not the most sort of accurate way of leaving a trace in the ground. For a start, somebody could nick it. But they may also move. The point about these baselines is that surveyors wanted the ability to be able to go back and re-measure them. So they were protected. They had to be protected. They had to be marked as monuments in the landscape. And what Colby chose was a slightly different approach. And there's this drawing here from the Royal Society, which is fascinating, which shows the design for the terminal towers, the baseline building, as it says there, which Colby was actually going to have created for the Lough Foyle baseline. And it says there, the center of the roof, you see the sort of cylindrical structure there. The center of the roof is formed of a stone having a hole in it. And if you look, it's a bit like a cork in a bottle to admit a smaller stone placed accurately over the points. So that's the kind of square thing with the writing on it, which you see there below the kind of cork thing. And that foundation stone, or that stone with the point on it, was the place that the measurements were being taken from and to. So it's really important that this marker stone was not affected, not moved, not destroyed. It had to be protected. But I like the bit about the boy may go down to clean the point. So they could lift off the little capstone thing, and the little boy would then be lowered down on a rope to then clean the points on that foundation stone there. But in the end, actually, the design chosen was one which didn't have that kind of little capstone and a covered monument. The design chosen in the end, and this is a diagram from the period, shows instead how these things were and how they still are actually, like the Ballykelly base tower and the north base tower I showed you in that photograph a little while ago. So these are the towers as they are. So the plate is still there. It's entombed in this tumulus. Is really interesting kind of terminology the Ordnance Survey are using here, I think. They talk about this circular shaped structure here with a chamber of masonry, and that's where the measurements were taken to and from, the baseline measurements. That's almost like a sarcophagus entombed in this circular shaped structure, which has, a certain kind of resonance, does it not, with some sort of prehistoric burial mounds. And not only that, the Ordnance Survey themselves are describing this as a tumulus of earth and a circular wall 2 feet thick, and so on and so forth. This is a substantial structure. It's a monument. This is why, I think we need to think about these as mapping monuments. Monuments which were designed to be permanent by the Ordnance Survey, in effect kind of memorializing their own activities in a way that gun of Mudge really did not do, did it? I mean, it's a fairly small thing and it could easily be moved or even stolen. But these are permanent markers in the landscape. They're designed to be seen. So it's linked into that baseline, which is this kind of foundation point to the Trigonometrical Survey of Ireland. There are these other trigonometrical stations. So in the next part of the talk, I want to say a little bit about these trigonometrical stations and the camps that are associated with some of them, and the cairns, which are the stone mounds that were built on top of these trigonometrical stations by the Ordnance Survey. So we're moving now from baselines and burials to camps and cairns. So remember the tent in the background there. The men had to live somewhere. They sometimes might have been billeted in local houses or inns or hotels, quite expensive, especially for the army. So they actually set up camp, normally in a place close to where they were undertaking their observations in the field, in the landscape. So the tents themselves were carried around from place to place and point to point because the whole of the Ordnance Survey operations was itinerant. It was peripatetic. It was moving. It was mobile. These men had to be moving around. And this is before railways, of course, in Ireland. We were talking here about the 1820s into the early 1830s. So this is quite a laborious thing to have to try and do, is it not? Now, I said we might visit other parts during this talk, and this is from Scotland, actually. Not a million miles from Fort William, actually, somewhere in the sort of off the west coast of Scotland. And this is the Ordnance Survey again, with this time a camp on Craigben, as it says there, in Argyllshire. And if you look here to the tents here in the foreground, they're not that dissimilar to the kind of bell tent that we see pictured on the Lough Foyle baseline. And the kinds of activities, this is a more or less contemporary drawing here from the London Illustrated News, I think. And this is actually accessible via Canmore, which is the Scottish historical and archaeological record. But if you look at this image for a moment, you see the tents, you can see the men, you can see some men digging, you can see a structure. There's infrastructure here. There are monuments in the landscape as part of this survey process. This is the summit of a mountain at Craigben, and this is the summit that was being used as a trigonometrical station to make the observations. And if you look towards the top of the image, on the skyline there, you can actually see the kind of beacon structure thing, and that is the trigonometrical station itself, from where the theodolite would have been used to take those observations backwards and forwards between the different mountain summits in this part of Scotland. So there is an infrastructure there, and this is part of this broader network of infrastructure that was required by the Ordnance Survey undertaking their field operations across these islands, not just in Scotland, but also over here in Ireland. And there's a little quotation there again from the memoir about Colby being out in Scotland and visiting those Western Islands, which is where Craigben is situated, but also coming across to the northeast part of Ireland, visiting Slieve Donald and other places, making those trigonometrical observations, undertaking them across the North Channel. In other words, linking up the trigonometrical triangles there, those triangles we saw earlier, that network, with a new network that was going to be established here on the northeast coast of Ireland. And the infrastructure that these guys created on Craigben is still there. It's on a monumental scale. Again, mapping monuments on a monumental scale. You see those circles in the foreground, in the middle distance there. Those circles are the circles where the tents were previously located. Those are the tents there to offer some protection, because these are exposed sites. You know, they're 2,000 or 3,000 feet above sea level. And the guys have to be there for a little while, because not only they're taking observations from this place, they're taking observations to another place, and from the other place back to this place. And this is how survey has to work. And in the case of Craigben, it wasn't just because it was quite a windy and exposed location, it wasn't just the tents that were protected by those circles, which look a bit like hut circles from the prehistoric period, which you can see in this photograph here from an article in Sheetlines. They also constructed these massive windbreaks, which are those huge stone walls you see. So all of this infrastructure is being created in the landscape. All of it's being created to facilitate this mapping work. This is what lies behind the map. Behind the map image, if we visit the field, go to these landscapes, these are the kinds of archaeological features we can find. What about a little bit closer to home though? Well, one of the trigonometrical stations not too far from the Lough Foyle baseline was erected on Slieve Snacht on the Inishowen Peninsula. And this aerial image here comes from GeoHive, which is the Ordnance Survey Ireland's web mapping application, which anybody can use. It's an amazing resource, and it has all sorts of aerial imagery and historic Ordnance Survey maps for people to look at. But this is a bit of aerial imagery of the summit of Slieve Snacht. Now, it looks quite a rocky summit, it is. What I want you to focus in on, if I can use my little arrow here, is this area. If we just zoom in a little bit more, what can we see? These features here, these circular features, which are ringed here, these circular features look pretty similar, do they not, to those on Craigben, which is just across the North Channel there. Even down to that square-shaped, more kind of substantial structure that was constructed. We've got some examples of those. And then the summit itself, a beacon, a cairn, a stone mound constructed on the summit for the theodolite. So here we have, I think, a previously unrecorded, I don't think there's a record of this, an archaeological record, I mean, a previously unrecorded Colby camp, these things are called, Colby camps after Thomas Colby, from the trigonometrical operations. So the little extract there tells us a bit about the survey station itself. The station, which is on the highest part of the mountain, which is Slieve Snacht, is marked by a stone. The importance of having these permanent markers, again, coming through so that the surveyors could revisit these sites as they actually did in the 1940s and 1950s with a retriangulation of Ireland. With a pile of stone 14 feet high and 50 feet in circumference. These are massive monuments, 50 feet in circumference at the base, erected over this stone to mark the trigonometrical station. So the cairn itself is quite a substantial piece of infrastructure. The buildings and the hut circles, again, quite a substantial part of example of infrastructure relating to the survey of Ireland under Colby. So we have a letter here, which is interesting, from Lieutenant Drummond. You might have heard of the Drummond lights, the lamp that Drummond invented for undertaking these observations across big distances, the limelight as it came to be. But anyway, Drummond is writing to Colby and tells us they were there in October 1825. The tent is now up, and in a few minutes, the wall around it will be completed. Well, this is interesting. We have the historical record and the archaeological record tallying up. so that we may consider ourselves safe from against any storm. 28th of October, a little bit later, because this took a long time to survey undertake these observations. They had to wait for the right weather conditions. Of the termination of our labours, the letters from Divis, which is another hill station, just outside Belfast, of course, which was used by the Ordnance Survey, will already have apprised you. At the last, we had nothing remaining but the lamp tent and the walls of the cooking house. I suspect the walls of the cooking house are one of those square-shaped structures we're looking at. I believe that we should have been compelled to abandon the hill, which is Sleep Snacked, but for the efforts of the men, 12th of November. It gives you a sense of the kind of difficulties, the conditions on these summit stations that had to be endured by the Ordnance Survey in order to create those maps, that paper landscape, which we celebrate today. There's a few more extracts here from Portlock's memoirs about the camp on Divis. Colby, I like this one. He says the officer of the day was called at the earliest dawn to rise and kept watch on the weather. And if the hill continued clear of fog, because again, you know, weather's really important to this, he called Colonel Colby. So Colby was there on the ground. He wasn't one of these kind of people who just sort of disappeared off and let everybody else get on with the job. He was there watching what was going on. Slieve Donard in the Moor Mountains, another station, 1826. And the mention there, the great instrument, the theodolite that was used, a 3-foot theodolite, a massive instrument actually, and very delicate as well. Now in the Science Museum in London. And then the third quotation from Saul from the Sperrin Mountains, again, you know, Colby left the mountain in November. You might think, well, what on earth are these people doing in the Sperrins in November? But actually, those of us who are from these parts, or not from these parts, or know these parts, you know from my accent, I'm not from these parts, but know these parts, will recognize actually that time of year, there can be some really clear weather, which is so important to undertake those observations with the theodolite there. But it's nice to see that again, Colby was there to enter with his wanton ardor into the duties of the observatory. The observatory is where this theodolite was situated on top of the summit of the mountain. So you know, what Portlock is saying here is that Colby was on the ground. He was one of the men. So what about other places? So this is Slieve Donard. This is from the Peroni Historical Map Viewer. Many of you would have, I hope, perhaps walked to the summit of Slieve Donard over the years. And the Mourne Wall is very visible there on this aerial image. The little peg there shows the situation of the apex of that wall, where there's a modern trigonometrical station, or trig pillars they're called these days. But the circle, the red circle, is an indication of the summit cairn as it was probably in the time of the first principal triangulation, it's called, in the 1820s, which presumably some of that stone was used for the construction of the wall. But in another circle off to the left-hand side of that image, you'll see a feature, which again is subcircular feature, which looks like one of these hut circles or enclosures, not dissimilar, pretty similar actually, to what we saw in Sleeve Snacked or even Craig Ben. How many more of these sites await our discovery, either through aerial photography, through drones, or through actual landscape survey, field survey on the ground? So I've actually taken some images of these summits from different parts of the internet. So thanks for those who have supplied these images. I think they're all Creative Commons. But so just to take you through some of these now, I need to just move this bar thing out of the way so I can actually see what I'm doing here. So this is Slieve Donard. So this is the cairn as it is now. And I think a lot of people probably think these cairns are prehistoric in origin. And indeed, some of them were. And they were repurposed, I think is the modern way of putting it, or recycled by the Ordnance Survey to create these summit stations. So this is the one on Slieve Donard and the quotation there about it. On very fine looking weather, actually. It's not always like that on the top of Slieve Donard, is it? Or is it? Let's move that on. So Saw, where we had a little quotation earlier on, again, somebody else's photograph, the concrete thing is a modern trig pillar. Modern in the sense that it was built in the 1950s, 60s from the retriangulation. It's on top of the earlier trigonometrical station, this pile of stones and turf 15 feet high, which is where Saul in 1827. Sleeve Snacked, again, not my photograph. So apologies if you know who that person is there, and it's you, and you've got this image of of a cairn there, which I'm using this image for really to again emphasize the substantial nature of this. So that quotation there, 14 feet high, the cairn, 50 feet in circumference at the base. And the actual marker stone would be underneath, actually buried underneath the cairn itself. And it's that marker stone, which is the permanent mark, which is so important in the trigonometrical survey work. This is Troston. Looks a little bit, maybe a bit denuded now, but here we have, originally it was a pile of turf 15 feet high and again 50 feet in circumference. And again, a modern trig pillar located on the top of it. So when we think about these as a network, then they are all interconnected and they were surveyed at different dates. The earliest one was Divis, 1825. And then the surveyors operated during the 1820s. So we are really now entering the bicentenary of all of this work, starting off at Divis and then moving northwards and then southwards as well. The dates are on the map there. So as well as those big kind of trigonometrical stations on hilltops and summits as part of this first order triangulation, it's called, as part of the principal triangulation work. There were also other lower order trigonometrical stations set up. And my former colleague, Mark Gardner, who's now at University of Lincoln, was an archaeologist at Queen's for many years. He would undertake field work on the north coast, the Antrim coast, and came across and sent me this photograph of a fairly small looking cairn. And he wondered whether it was, rather than being a clearance cairn, was actually perhaps the remains of the Ordnance Survey operations. And it's interesting, there's a little quotation there from Charles Close's book on the early years of the Ordnance Survey, a quotation about the early operations of the Ordnance Survey in Scotland and how various hills in Ireland had been marked by signals. These are the kind of cairns here, and they often would have had flags or structures, timber structures built on top of them, and were linked up by intersection to the Scottish hills. So it's highly likely along the North Antrim coast, and indeed the North Coast generally, there'll be examples of these small cairns. So they are also out there awaiting our discovery. Well, I'm going to be ending fairly soon, folks. I notice the time is already 20 past 8. Time flies. So I'm going to say a few words about levelling, which is another operation used by the Ordnance Survey. Trigonometrical survey is really for calculating horizontal angles and distances by indirect means. But on maps as well, you'll also notice many maps show heights. And the heights on those maps, the elevation as it's called, is derived from a process of levelling. And that doesn't mean literally levelling as in squashing. It means using a spirit level to take measurements and to make observations, to look at the rise and fall of the land, if you like. So we have the trigonometrical network looking at the angles and the horizontal measurements through indirect means, and then we have the vertical observations through levelling. So some of you may be familiar with the kind of things we call benchmarks. There's lots of different types of benchmarks. We can find them on our doorstep quite literally sometimes. So these are some examples I picked up on my travels. I like to go around logging benchmarks, and making a note of recording them. Other people like that as well. And hopefully I'll convert you into one of those too if you're not one already. But the little diagram there shows you how these things were used. So the level itself and the staffs and the sites which were used on those spirit levels and the readings that were taken, and where the staff was planted, then the Ordnance Survey put down a mark, again, a permanent mark. These, again, mapping monuments. They're there to create permanence in the landscape unless somebody comes on and destroys it, which does happen, of course, now. But these things were created 150 years ago originally by the Ordnance Survey, and over the decades since as well, right the way into the latter part of the 20th century, so for quite some time. So these benchmarks are from different time periods. They're represented on the Ordnance Survey, historic Ordnance Survey maps, like the 6-inch map. This comes from the Crony Historical Map Bureau again, from Queen's University, one of the editions from the 1970s. And you'll see in the square there, it says BM, that's benchmark. And then the numbers are the height of the benchmark. And there's a little kind of arrow thing, sometimes called a crow's foot. And the arrow indicates the benchmark, which is the kind of things we're looking at here. So the field and the map kind of come together in the representation of benchmarks. That arrow symbol is common to both. Now, the levelling operations were undertaken a little bit later than the trigonometrical work that I mentioned a moment ago. So this was going on in the latter part of the 1830s into the 1840s, as you can see here. And the initial levelling lines they're called, the principal lines of spirit levelling in Ireland, mainly followed the important routes and roads. And what you've got to think about is that these guys were out in the field, not just undertaking the trigonometrical survey from the summit stations and so forth, but also dragging their chain and their spirit levels and their staffs from place to place, all the places on this map actually represented here, including through Ballykelly, because it was important, again, to link up these levelling lines, which again form a network, like the trigonometrical network was triangles. These are levelling lines forming a network so that different elevations could be calculated across the island as part of the survey work. So as a little quotation there, or a little bit of text there about Colby died in 1852, and the last of the maps for Ireland at the 6-inch scale was published in 1846, a huge undertaking, £820,000, which obviously at that time was a massive amount of money now, but you can imagine it was a huge amount of money then. If we look at some of the written records of the levelling operations, you can begin to see, and these are available, we can in our project, we can look at these in a little bit more detail. But the Ordnance Survey were absolutely meticulous in recording these observations. So this is one of the levelling lines from Londonderry to Ballykelly, which you saw on that map a moment ago. And if you look at the details here, what they're recording here are the locations of the benchmarks, whose house it was on, whether it was on a wall, whereabouts in terms of the height above the centre of the road, for example, the distances between the benchmarks, the height, of course, the benchmarks, and the county sheet of the Ordnance Survey 6-inch they related to. So if we look at Ballykelly then, and this is from the 2nd edition Ordnance Survey 6-inch series on the Peroni Historical Map Bureau again, I've circled the various benchmarks which were listed here, which are out in the field, and these are the benchmarks which were recorded in that list there. And these are the kinds of benchmarks. There's one on the base tower there in the little picture you can see. These are the benchmarks which are all part of this monumentalizing of the field survey operations of the Ordnance Survey. These were permanent marks, or at least they saw them to be permanent marks in the landscape. And they are, in many cases, as you can see from the photograph, still there awaiting discovery and recording. So this is all leading towards what I want to end on, which is thinking about this as survey heritage. Another part of the Ordnance Survey's operations in terms of calculating heights involved running chaining lines through the landscape. So this is the 1st edition Ordnance Survey map. So we'll be looking at Binevenagh here. And you know what the terrain is like, many of you, for this part of the world. This is difficult work. And the quotation there from both Close and from Portlock kind of indicates how much of an arduous task this would have been, not just doing the trigonometrical work. The trigonometrical stations on maps are shown by the little triangle there next to where it says Binevenagh, with a triangle with a dot in the middle. And those lines of numbers are actually spot heights. These are where the surveyors went through the landscape, recording elevation in the landscape, and then marking those ultimately on the map. And we can retrace those in the field, and even actually sometimes in the field find very subtle features like this bolt on a boulder, would you believe? This is a Divis in Black Mountain, as you can see. And so the Ordnance Survey, some of the heritage is actually quite small heritage. And it's not always the big monumental stuff like we were seeing earlier in the case of Sleeve Snact, or indeed the Lough Foyle baseline. And there is a group of people, myself included, interested in this heritage. But what I would suggest perhaps is that much of the emphasis has been really more on the more recent landscape legacies of the Ordnance Survey, the trig pillars, the concrete pillars from the retriangulation from the 1950s and 60s in Ireland, the flush brackets, again from the 20th century, rather than the 19th century Ordnance Survey heritage. So I want to end now, in the last couple of minutes, I've tested your patience enough, by thinking a little bit about what I've just been mentioning, the landscape legacies and mapping monuments, but more in terms of their significance as heritage. So moving from a historical and archaeological story and more to one thinking about, okay, the here and now, and what does this mean to us today, and what should we be doing with this material. So the Mapping Monuments project is a heritage project, it's a community heritage project. There's a whole group of people involved from Queen's, as well as obviously Grace and Andrew, and hopefully yourselves as well in due course. So there's me, there's Will McGarry. Some of you will have met Will. You'll know Connor, I'm sure. Siobhan as well from archaeology, and my colleague Elaine Reid from the Centre for Data Digitalisation and Analysis at Queen's. So we're all working together, but we need volunteers to make this really work. We need you. So these talks we're doing and so on are all hopefully drumming up some interest and not putting people off too much. So the heritage of the Ordnance Survey and Lough Foyle baseline, it has actually previously, some of you may well know this, leaflets from the Limmer Valley Heritage Trail. This was a PDF online, that's how I got it. So recognition locally, certainly, of the importance of this heritage from a few years ago. So for heritage interpretation of tourism. But I think there's more we can do. There's more to be found in the local landscape. And of course, you know, time moves. We now have digital heritage. We have global heritage. I mentioned the importance of the linkages between what Colby was doing on Lough Foyle baseline in Ireland and what George Everest was doing with the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. And you'll see the little picture there, bottom left-hand corner. You've seen that already, the Lough Foyle baseline. But the one from the top left is from Calcutta. It's from West Bengal. So George Everest, the great surveyor, not the mountain was named after the surveyor, not by himself actually, but in his honor, because he calculated through the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, the heights of the Himalaya mountains, you see. So anyway, so in Calcutta, he created a baseline just because it was a necessity for the trigonometrical survey, like it was for Colby in Ireland. A little bit later, and he took Colby's bars, you can see them in that contemporary image there. And the big tower with the men standing on top of it is the equivalent of one of our base towers for the Ballykelly, like Ballykelly base tower or the Lough Foyle baseline base towers. Much more elevated because they had to see over the vegetation, over the flat plains of Bengal. And these things are still there. My colleague Satish Kumar and I from geography at Queen's worked with the University of Calcutta, and we went out and we visited these sites with Siobhan, in fact, actually. And so we visited these sites, we talked to local people. It was a community heritage project. And we've got scope now, I think, through this project, Mapping Monuments, to make these broader connections globally and emphasize the importance of this local heritage in a kind of global context. And this is heritage under threat. This is some work by Connor. So he used modern aerial imagery, and here Joe referenced the Ordnance Survey 6-inch map, Mount Sandy Base Tower. You can see has already fallen into the sea at McGilligan there. So this heritage is heritage under threat, which is why I think we need to go back into the field. We need to survey the surveyors. We need to go back to those sites and monuments, those surveying sites in the landscape, back to the field, and recover from those landscapes the monuments, the sites and monuments that were created, that infrastructure that was created in the field. And from that process, from our project, create those kinds of outputs and create a kind of greater, I hope, recognition of the importance, not just locally, nationally, or even internationally, but for all of us, the importance of these landscape legacies of the Ordnance Survey. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you ever so much for bearing with me. Thank you for the invitation to Grace and Andrew for me to talk on this. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions and have a discussion. Thanks ever so much.